My pleasure, actually. The last conversation was so refreshing, and I felt like I should jump in and have a conversation with the panel itself because, when Chris brought up the questions about should we control sort of the study, and when Dan was going back and forth, it was like, oh, I should be part of that conversation too. But I said, it'll probably cut into my time, so I just refrained from that. Having said that, let me just walk you through, when you think about this, there's tools, technologies, and you could call them devices at some point, right? At CDRH, we've been thinking about this for a while, and I think one of the concepts that has come across for us is, when these tools used to make drugs or medical devices, they're called tools. And then when these exact same tools are commercialized because the business plan says so, then they become devices. And so how do we deal with them? I think the problems are not so far apart. So let me just walk you through probably some boring slides in the beginning, but I'll stop on a few that actually, in relation to the discussion that we were just having, we can have some conversations on that. At the end of the day, we want whatever we call these technologies, tools, enabling things to provide the best confidence in the products that are being developed with, products that are developed for, and if they're used. So if you sort of take that concept and what does FDA's role become as part of that journey is really what I have been thinking about and my group has been thinking about for a while. The definition of a medical device is really broad. If you think about a thing that's used in diagnosing, treating, curing, or mitigating a disease or a condition is considered a device. So now that does not mean that everything under the sun is a device. It has a very prescribed sort of boundaries around it. It has to be for diagnosing in man or animals, or diagnosing or preventing. Recently, 21st Century Cures Act actually said, CDRH has been saying that we don't mean everything, and here's the things that we care less about. And Cures sort of said, agree with you, FDA, and we're going to say those things that are just promoting healthy lifestyle are not necessarily part of the definition of a device. So that's sort of the carve-out that happened. That's just one example, and there's a couple other things that happen with that. But CDRH generally thinks about, the discussion we were having this morning about, whether we should call it diagnostics or if it's a biomarker or any other thing, it's some form of the other of those things can be a device. An in vitro diagnostic test can be a device, and those have been regulated. But then in addition to the very simple examples that we get to regulate not in the same way every time is things like tongue depressors. And you have to think about that for a second, why, and then you'll get the answer. But I think that's one of the things. And if you can think about the entire spectrum of the device world, to robotic surgery devices, to pacemakers, et cetera, and the list goes on. But they're not regulated in the same way. So I get this question all the time, do you regulate everything in the same way as TENS? The answer is no. Obviously, the tongue depressors have a standard of, you shall manufacture and make it sterile all the time, so you're not putting infection into people's mouth when the doctors actually use that in their practice. And then to the end of the spectrum of class 3, where it's reserved for very high sort of impact and a risk to patients if it didn't work right. And so the examples of that are the implantables. But majority of our work at CDRH is in that middle bucket, that's class 2, that's moderate risk. And that's where we spend a lot of this time. And if you can think about in the context of digital health, and this kind of came out in this today in the morning's discussion, is we are recognizing this convergence is happening in front of us, and how do we sort of get this revolution that's happening, that moving care from a clinic to the patient themselves and in the place where they are. And that's how we've been thinking about it. And then understanding patient's behavior and physiology. And this was a conversation like I was like latching onto it in the last panel was, it is about not knowing everything. It's about we know certain things because we manage to know in those contexts, but we really don't know all the things that can happen or are important. we think it may be important, but we really don't know if it's important or not. So I think that exploration is the enablement that's happening with digital health. And then this massive movement towards prevention is sort of happening with digital health, which means early diagnosing, early detection, early interventions, sometimes just behavioral, sometimes just lifestyle, is actually powerful. And I think, I don't know about everybody have sort of proven that, but it seems logically true that it can happen. And so the effort that's going on, and today's discussion about how can we make sure that we all agree that it can happen in a scientific way, that we can prove it, and that's where the work sort of comes together. We've been using this definition of what we call digital health technology. It does definitely cross the entire spectrum. That doesn't necessarily mean it's all a medical device or some other tool that FDA is always interested in. It is about, it could be used as a medical product, it could be a device or a drug or anything like that, or therapy. It could be incorporated into a medical product. We've seen examples of that already. It could be used to develop, and then we talked a few things about that, and to study a product as well. And there was some conversation briefly about companion. And I think about, there is this concept of digital tools can become companion in how they're used or to be used, that traditionally called as companion diagnostics. And then there's this concept of companion therapeutics, that it can amplify the therapy that's been sort of provided. Or let's say it's not amplified, but it's almost necessary to make sure that it's personalized in a certain way. So there may be different sort of modalities in that. So if you think about those sort of the domains there's purview for FDA's sort of look into where this can fall. So here we are, lots of gadgets sensing us all along our pathway, different ways of monitoring and looking at it. And it can actually become valuable, but we really don't know where. So what qualifies as a digital health product? You can think about from the previous slide where it sort of falls into, and one could imagine, yes, writing an email or tapping into a phone can actually tell you something, but can we tell something different than what we can do in a clinical setting? Those are the challenges, right? When we talked about better informed consumers, so the information part is one, sort of the diagnostic part is a different one, and how do you draw the lines? And these are the kind of challenges we have as we move forward. And then what's the best way to regulate these products, if we need to regulate these products, and where? And we have been thinking at CDRH these questions of how do you sort of move forward. If you look at from a pure therapeutic sort of application, here are some of the things that actually, I took a slide from Walter Greenleaf. Some of you may know him already. And he nicely plotted this slide out and said, you're now getting into something that technology can provide that only a counselor would have been providing in the past. And that is something which is different nowadays. So how do you sort of go have that technology do a CME that we expect doctors and clinicians to be having? So thinking from those angles. Not to take this to the next level, but you're now seeing different players, different technology, different modalities of therapy sort of entering. And all of these can be used in the drug development. All of these can be used to become a biomarker. And how do you sort of bring it together and say, we kind of know this. We kind of know this, and we can trust it, and we can have this confidence. And that's a journey. And I truly believe that we are on the cusp of determining that with the computing technology we have in front of us, but not necessarily know it yet. And we don't know how this is going to really sort of inform our future drug development or medical device development or other things. This is another slide that compares what is a digital biomarker and how is it different, and et cetera. So there's lots of debate going on, even on this slide, within FDA, and I've seen others talk about it. And let me reflect on one editorial comment in my head that was going on as I'm thinking about this presentation. I'm thinking, we really know what we know, and we really don't know what we don't know, and that has been sort of amplified by this technology being in front of us. And when I say that, I think we're very comfortable in recognizing what we have been doing for last many, many, many years. And when we have something else shown to us and it's not proven, the scientist in us sort of comes out and goes, prove it. And then we can't prove it because only computers can do it. We have this dichotomy between the silicon-based analysis engine and the carbon-based analysis engine that we are. And how do we sort of bring it together? And I think that's what we're talking about. Just to draw a spectrum of where things kind of fall, this is what a collection of sort of tools that have been sort of brought together. And I think it's the boxes are drawn just for depiction's sake, but I think these things are blurring. And this Venn diagrams between health and wellness and diagnostics are sort of blurring as well. Fast forwarding to sort of why does it all matter? Why did I share all this? I think it comes down to this one fundamental thing when it comes to devices is that piece of software that's going to bring all this information together, regardless of where this information is coming from and what's generating it. And when we think about what's generated the information, if we have the validity or don't have the validity in the, in the things that generate the information, can this software in this space, we have termed it as software as a medical device, can it actually do things that we say we want it to do in the right way that we want it to do? Which means if it were to fit in the rubric of a medical device, can it diagnose, treat, cure, mitigate, et cetera, in the proper way? In a drug development environment, can it do what it's supposed to do for the endpoint we're seeking to sort of achieve for the development? In a device, I could say the same thing. So in the international forum, which is parallel to the ICH world, the IMDRF, which is International Medical Devices Regulators Forum, is a parallel entity that brings medical device regulators together. This term was coined in 2014, which basically started bringing the regulators across the world start to think about, let's get the validity of the signals generated and separate from the analysis part out and think about that as like that's a new world that we'll have to face, and how do you bring that together? Along with that doesn't come simplicity, it comes more complexity. As we think about from a regulatory perspective, we have development timelines that moving of these products, which when we talk software, can move from, in traditional world from years to software development cycles to be very small. So these are all regulatory challenges, and it's iterative. We have the opportunity to collect post-market data similar to what was happening in SAGE, where you're collecting passive information all the time from a product, and can it inform how the product can evolve over time? And that's what we've been thinking. And then from a regulatory perspective, being really selfish about FDA, there's a volume problem. We'll have a lot more of these products show up on our doorstep, and the question is how best to sort of evolve, and how do you make sure these products still meet the same level of confidence that we want. The work at IMDRF actually produced a book of work which basically talks through the definition, through the framework of what's necessary for clinical validation for this kind of clinical evaluation of these products. I shouldn't say validation because it's just one of the things that we want these products to be clinically valid. Most importantly, I think we didn't want to lump everything in that software as a medical device framework into one large category. But however, we wanted to make sure that there is some distinction in terms of the conversation that was happening all morning about what is the product doing and the context of use of the product. So if you think about what is on the highest end of the spectrum, you think about diagnostic image analysis that's used to make very acute decisions in acute situations. And if you move further down, you can see the reliance on this information or the importance of this information becomes smaller, and there's a lot more reliance on sort of the human part of the diagnosing or the treatment decision making. And going further down, it is becoming more and more one piece of information that's necessary to make a choice in care. And at the end, the very small is bringing things together and presenting in a way that's most useful in a clinical setting. one of the key concepts that emerged out of this conversation was, with software as a medical device, things are not going to be static. People are going to starting with something that we all know and we think it's fairly safe, and eventually learn enough, not eventually, I think continuously learn enough and move up the spectrum of this impact and the reliance that the clinicians or even the patients may have along the way. However, I think one of the things we said that independence of the review of the person making this evaluation, clinical evaluation, to be present is important in the higher end of the spectrum than the lower end. So what does this clinical evaluation look like? I think we talked about this today. And I'm going to not highlight 2 and 3 because there was a lot of discussion on analytical and clinical validation. But I think one of the key things that emerged out of this body of work is that clinical association. We've talked a lot today about what is that clinical association. And when we talk in terms of biomarkers, we all know that a heart rate equals X, but we don't know heart rate measured at 60 hertz or once every minute. What does that look like in terms of what does that mean? So we're saying that valid clinical association is actually more important than we used to know before. But if you miss that out, I think we'll have these questions about, I don't know your TAP test is equal to the same thing that we used to do before, or we don't know that 20 steps gait test that somebody used to observe is the same thing as managed by some accelerometer or a gyroscope in your pocket or somewhere on your waist. And those questions are valid. I think what we're hearing and what I'm hearing today is that becomes the most important piece of the puzzle that needs to be solved. And we need to figure out how do you move from that assumption of it is the same to it is different, but this is how it is different, or this is how it can be used. And to me, when it comes down to digital biomarkers, or you want to call it any other technology, I think that becomes sort of the most important part of the puzzle. And we can prove that. And it's not about proven many times, it's also well understood. And when you think about this concept, well understood, like by whom? By the people in this room? The answer is probably no. We need a lot more people to understand and sort of accept it, so when they see X, they understand what to do with it. And I think that's the challenge we're in, and we're in a crossroads for that conversation to happen, and love to sort of see how we can advance that field as we move forward. I do want to point out to the point I made earlier is with software, things will evolve and things will grow. So what regulatory structure that we're envisioning is if there is a mechanism to monitor, to instrument the products themselves, to collect this real world information, and bring that back into the intended use of like what the product is doing and keep informing it, we may be in sort of a place where not just thinking retrospective, but not just thinking prospective trial, you could almost combine the observational studies that can happen with the product used for different intended uses and bring it together sort of and inform the next evolution of the claim that may be for that particular product. So how do you sort of bring that together? We are all, I mean, again, I'm not going to pretend to know all the answers here. We're in the process of building this now and in the device world, and how do you bring it together? What does that mean for things to be monitored and observed and use that observational information to bring it back into a claim when we have questions about the clinical association on various measurements that the product can potentially collect. Work in progress, and I think I'm looking forward to the work that this group can sort of bring to the table and the community can bring to the table. I do want to end with a couple things here. I do believe the gold standard that we have, I'm going to go the other way and say maybe not so gold as we start seeing different types of evolution of data as we move forward. Again, I'm being a heretic, I'm being provocative on purpose to start thinking about it from this perspective. let's start thinking about patient-generated versus patient-reported. I'm a technologist by training, so I know the lesser humans can sort of intervene in collection of data, the better off we are. So I think passive is the goal. How do you get passive to be trusted is the answer we are looking for. And, you know, accessing trial participants and data outside of clinical setting is sort of, you know, we all talk about distributed clinical trials, et cetera. I think it comes down to understanding behaviors of trial participants outside of the clinical settings might be a key for us to know. And maybe this goes back to the foundational conversation that got started earlier today is, you know, what are the new measures and how do those measures actually are valid? From a understanding perspective, I'm not suggesting we do validate everything, but I'm just suggesting we know what the pluses and minuses are so we can actually bring it to light and use it in the right way. I do want to leave one thought that came to me as the conversations were happening this morning is, I think today's world, we think about a pristine signal and then we have a perfect correlation. I think there's a world, and it comes from actually technology side where, and I'll use an analogy really quick, the GPS signal that you see on your phone and tells you where you are exactly is an amalgamation of 5 or 15 inputs that are really, really crappy that just tells you exactly where you are in this building. Examples of there are there 15 satellites, 8 of them are sometimes active, and you need only 6 to sort of know where you are within a block. Then you add on top of it a Google map that was collected from the space and mapped your surroundings. Then you know how many steps you went up, so you know what level you are. And you bring, does any of those things very accurate? Probably not. When you bring it all together, it actually puts you right here in this room. And I think we are, when you think about technologists and engineers trying to solve healthcare problems, they're trying to do that. The question is, are we in this room or not? So I'm going to leave you with that. and then just share sort of where we're heading. I think there's a need at FDA and other places to sort of start thinking about, you know, how do you bring and amplify this work, all this work that's happening across the agency. And Cures actually asked us to stand up a Center of Excellence, which is a work in progress. We'll be talking more about that. And it's really the work that Chris and Steve and others are doing in other parts of the agency that can be amplified and sort of reused. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
I think we have time for a couple of questions, because while we have Dr. Patel here, let's ask him. Maybe I'll start and I'll kind of point at Chris as well. Clinical association was one of the things you just talked about. I'm wondering if that's actually the corollary to biomarker, to the physiologically relevant thing that we're measuring in a person. So.
Well,
okay.
I think this would apply to both of our product centers.
Yeah.
At least for us, clinical relevance is around the patient experience and whether or not they are improving from their disease condition and the afflictions thereof. I think the same would be true for devices in that you're trying to make a clinical claim around healthcare delivery or decisions. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
It is in concept similar to what Chris was talking about. I think it's about the word association is about we understand when it is appropriate to measure steps when you're trying to, or the way somebody walks to gait. If you start talking about GPS location to gait, that's it's not naturally apparent that it's associated. And so when somebody comes up with that kind of signal and says, oh wait, I can tell you where you are and that will tell you what the gait is, we would question that. And I think when we start talking about what's a valid clinical association, I think that's the concept in the paper.
So, and I guess what I was trying to get at was that the biomarker is separate from, or the COA is separate from the way you measure it, and that clinical association would be separate from maybe the software that is being used to generate the final.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
I mean, in part two, this was my comments to the previous panel, trying to get at some level of granularity around task. And certainly the arguments that were brought forward are valid. I think when you're trying to use a digital monitoring for movement, movement is a very broad concept. So trying to subdivide it of even sit to stand, although your chair may be different in every home environment, if that patient uses the same chair by protocol in the same time of day, et cetera, that at least takes away one of the variables. Because what you're trying to do is in that home environment, capture information real time, but trying to reduce the number of variables that could influence your interpretation that have no relevance to whether or not the benefit is actually an improvement or not. You know, stairs in homes may be of different heights, but if the patient's using the same set of stairs every day in their home environment, then that's okay. Because what you're trying to look for is changes or trends for a given person, and then look at the population at large.
Yeah, I think Abhi was the one who was talking about how now just collecting this level of information might be able to discern what was prospectively designed to be very, very prescriptive in terms of use only this chair and not use this other chair while you're measuring whatever you're measuring. I think the power of measuring all the time, you can start using computational power to discern some of those differences. And once you figure out or remove out those, I don't want to call it bias, but those noise from the signal, I think you have a potential to get to the same place that a prospective trial may actually get to.
During the comment period, someone else was saying, well, if you collect enough information on a single patient for a long enough period of time, then these sort of day-to-day variations for confounding factors kind of go away. Well, then that needs a lot of data for a lot of patients for a lot of time. So, for instance, someone got the flu, was in the bed for a week, and they didn't move. You may misinterpret why they didn't move. That's the kind of things that I was trying to bring forward.
Hey, Bakul, Ryan McGowan, AstraZeneca. You talked about moving from a clinical tool in an investigational study to a medical device in commercial. But sometimes you may have a clinical tool that meets the definition of a medical device in your investigational study, right? It does one of those things that meets the basic element of the definition. And then theoretically, we have to apply design controls in the clinical stage, which can be burdensome, and some of our partners aren't, they don't have those qualifications. Can you talk a little bit about if the agency can apply flexibility in that clinical stage to not expect a full set of design control documents?
So I won't speak for CDER, but I can tell you sort of high level from a conceptual, that's the way I think about it. I think about if you're using and I'm going to make it a really silly example, but if you're using a pen to do a study, in a study, and if the study is absolutely dependent on that pen, you probably need to have some validation associated with it. Or if you created the pen on your own, then you need to know the provenance of that, and you sort of do that. So now replace the pen with a potentially, what would be considered as a medical device, yet not commercially distributed. Then I think you would need the same level of sort of guarantee or confidence. So so the level of influence it has on the study is known. So if you think about it from that perspective, that's how I think about it. Now, the fact that it can be a medical device is a different rubric that allows you commercialization of that tool, whatever that is used in practice. Now, that's where sort of the nuances sort of comes into play, where if that tool just happens to be a medical device and you now only use it for other purposes, you can promote it as a medical device. Like glucose meter don't have to be a medical device. Glucose meter only be a thing that can be used in a study, and then all the things that is required for a glucose meter can be. Now, this is again an absurd example, but think about it from that angle.
I think conceptually, I agree with you, and I think that's a logical way, hopefully, to apply it. But I think the practical struggle that we have sometimes is that if you're provisioning a medical device, or what was maybe commercially a medical device, into a clinical study, then there are certain documentation, data standards, 60601, electrical safety requirements that practically we see reviewers ask for, and both in CDRH and CDER. and that can be a barrier, I think, to
I would love to hear a lot more about that, and sort of, I think this is the kind of feedback we would like to sort of see as we're moving towards, making sure that, our regulatory apparatus is actually much more fit for purpose as well.
Yeah.
We would love to sort of hear a lot more of this, because I think if we are asking information that's already been asked before, I would hate for us to review it. Just we are resource constrained too, again, but maybe it's in a different context. If use the glucose meter example one more second, and if it's used for, it was designed and approved for a glucose meter use, but in the study it's used for something else. I think there's enough confidence need to be needed for the reviewer to go, yes, it's not going to affect. So I think there's some nuances there, but love to sort of hear a little bit more.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, so I think my question is very much in line with the previous question, but maybe a bit of a different angle. So from our perspective, we build devices, we build medical devices, but we don't put a box on a shelf and say, here, you can buy it and figure it out. We co-develop it together with pharma or other people that have a specific interest, and we tweak the final parameters for a specific group of people so that we have an optimal solution. That's the general idea. But that kind of goes head to head with how the regulatory space works, right? Because saying like, oh yeah, we're leaving some flexibility in the system to do this and this and this, that generally doesn't really work well as an argument. So that's why I was very interested to see your slide on the real world data aspect. Because that's something that we're thinking heavily about. Like, how can we leverage that framework to already do an evidence-based collection of data to figure these things out while we have that flexibility in the system and we're optimizing it without having the need to like fully flesh it out and then go to patients.
Yeah, there's lots of work being done in both centers, like in CDER as well as CDRH, actually even CBER, on real-world sort of real-world use of evidence in claims. Right, and progressive claims, if you may. I don't know nuances of your particular product, but if it's in CDER, I think there's lots of conversation that can be had in how that can be used. I think for device world, the same thing. I think we do have lots of experience doing that. So I'm not sure about the exact particular situation that you're mentioning, but I think the agency, if you look at all the discussions on real world, use of real-world data and evidence in approvals and clearances of the products, I think we have been very forthcoming in sort of saying we want to use that, because I think the goal for the agencies always has been is how do we get products to market that are with high confidence faster, and I think because I would say that's exactly the goal for all centers at FDA that has been involved in this space. So I think there's agreement that it can happen. Exact nuances have to be talked through whatever area you're working with.
And maybe very practical then, so on that specific slide you were alluding to the fact that this is currently something that the FDA is internally thinking about. Is it an internal thing, or are you also looking for feedback from, commercial academic partners in that specific?
Chris, and you can speak up, but I think there's a lot of conversation even now happening in the drugs world that you can talk to the teams and in a specific area that will engage you with that particular thing. So it's definitely open, even in a case-by-case basis and a particular submission basis you can sort of discuss. So I would speak for CDRH. I think we have the same sort of concepts.
I would agree. I mean, there's a number of public workshops, there's guidance documents with public comment periods around real-world data collection and usability. So there's many different avenues that we certainly seek public input and perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah.